started. I know that we are still waiting for one of our panelists to join, but I'm going to get us going just to kind of introduce our amazing panelists, which is going to take a couple minutes anyway, and then turn it over to our moderator to get us started. But I just wanted to first thank you everyone and introduce myself. I'm with the Green Latino staff. My name is Irene Burga. I'm the Climate and Cleaner Program Director at Green Latinos, and just wanted to thank everyone for your participation for the last couple of days in our summit. We've had some incredible sessions, and mostly it's because of the incredible engagement that's been going on. So just thank you, and thanks for attending this session. This is the Future Ports, Greening Our Supply Chains in Nuestra Comunidad. And today we will be discussing the evidence of the pandemic-fueled mania of online purchasing is plain to see across the U.S. seaports, affecting supply chains, greenhouse gas emissions, and air pollution concentrations in surrounding seaport communities, which are largely made up of people of color who suffer disproportionate environmental impacts resulting from transportation emissions and other polluting factors. From LA to New York and everywhere in between, we are grappling with a supply chain crisis. While the Biden administration is pushing to provide some investments in cleaning up our ports, much more needs to be done to achieve a massive shift in moving away from fossil fuel burning technology and toward creating a zero-emission ports future. In this session, you will hear from folks working hard to turn the tide on polluting ports practices from Houston, Los Angeles, and New York, New Jersey ports. This session will cover barriers to greening supply chains, a toll on surrounding communities, and opportunities locally, regionally, and nationally to create actionable change that is felt and impacted frontline communities. So I just want to introduce our panelists. I'll start with our left square, Yvette Arellano. Yvette is the founding director of Fenceline Watch, an environmental justice advocacy group dedicated to the eradication of toxic multi-generational harm on communities living along the fence line of industry. Yvette serves as a board member for the Center of International Environmental Law, Backbone Campaign, Green Latinos, and Peak Plastic Foundation, and is based in Houston, Texas. We have also Melissa Miles on the bottom left corner. Melissa serves as the executive director of the New Jersey Environmental Justice Alliance, a statewide organization dedicated to serving New Jersey's low-income and of-color communities overburdened by the impact of pollution and climate change. Melissa serves on several boards, including the Environmental Justice Advisory Council, EJAC, at the New Jersey Department of Environmental Protection, where she serves as co-chair of the AIR community. And then we have also, hopefully joining us soon, will be Angelo Logan. Angelo is the policy and campaign director for the Moving Forward Network and co-founder of East Yard Communities for Environmental Justice in Los Angeles, California. Angelo serves on the White House Environmental Justice Advisory Council and the Harbor Community Benefit Foundation, social and environmental entrepreneurs, and California EV charging infrastructure strike force as co-chair. And then, last but not least, our incredible moderator, we have Paul Presendu. Did I pronounce it right? Okay. Presendu Cuesta. Paul is the outreach manager for Sustainable Westchester, a nonprofit consortium of 44 municipal governments in Westchester County, New York, that helps support countywide climate resilience and renewable energy transition projects. Paul serves on several boards, including the United Nations Foundation as their global ambassador for the 13th Sustainable Development Goal, Climate Action. So thank you all so much. I'm going to just go ahead and say that let's get started. And if Angelo joins, then fantastic. And I'm going to turn it over to Paul, our amazing moderator, to kind of go through the questions. Also, please, throughout today's panel, for the audience, please drop in any questions in the chat, and we're going to devote some time for Q&A at the end also from the audience. So thank you all. Paul?
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you so much, Irene. And I want to first thank our wonderful panelists, Melissa Miles and Yvette Arellano. The work you're doing truly is invaluable for us to really go through the equitable transition of our supply chains and make sure that we're decarbonizing for not only the quality of life of all residents, but also the protection of the public health, especially for the communities that happen to live in proximity of high carbon emissions. And I'm talking about the Hispanic community or people of color in general. Some of the work that I've done, I do professionally. It deals with establishing clean energy or renewable energy alternatives. For example, community choice aggregations, which allows for residents to have a renewable energy option as opposed to the monopoly we see at certain utility grids through companies such as Con Edison. And the facts is already out there of the people that live in proximity to these fossil fuel based energy producers or generators, or the communities that live in proximity of the peaker plants that are turned on when utility grids are at peak load. So when we're talking about greening our supply chains, that conversation should really be taught, should really occur at the genesis of how we're creating our electricity supply, and also making sure that we have a decarbonization of our method and modes of transportation. With green electricity comes renewable energy alternatives and the boosting of a green economy, which could help with create the creation of a circular economy so that people could be the next HVAC technicians, the next environmental engineers, and they could be able to have those positions in their local communities so they could be able to provide the financial support to their local school districts to feed that loop that we're uplifting stronger and champions to help lead the fight when we're cuando somos viejos and things like that. So at this moment, I'll first I guess I'll give the floor to each of you. We have a little bit of time to quickly introduce yourself and share a little bit of work that you're doing in decarbonization before I go back to our questions. So I guess we'll start with you, Yvette Arellano. If you want to quickly introduce yourself and say a couple of words in relation to your work in decarbonization of our supply chains.
Thank you. My name is Yvette Arellano. I'm the founder and director of Fenceline Watch, based here in Houston, Texas, which is also home to the largest petrochemical complex in our nation. And it is the #1 port for liquid tonnage, or chemicals, oils, liquids, and gases. So the Houston Ship Channel, which makes up most of our port activity, is composed of 52 miles of ports activity with over 200 industries that are feeding directly off of that port activity, and is currently undergoing a deepening and a widening of from 170 feet wide to over 700 feet wide, and then deepening of about 46 feet at our ports. So we're definitely experiencing increased activity, which is increased pollution and increased health impacts. And so the work that I'll be speaking about is directly related to the Houston Ship Channel and this kind of expansion. I'll pass it on to Melissa.
Thank you, Yvette, and welcome, Angelo. Good to see you. And thank you, Paul, for bringing us into the session today. My name is Melissa Miles, and I'm the executive director of the New Jersey Environmental Justice Alliance. As the name states, we are based in New Jersey, and here in New Jersey, we work closely with frontline communities that are dealing with the impacts of legacy pollution, much of it through industry. I know that this is, the audience is coming from all over the country, but here on the East Coast, folks have referred to New Jersey by such beautiful names as the armpit of New York. And the reason for that being is, as we know, New York is one of the if not the wealthiest metropolitan area in the world. It has one of the largest consumer bases in terms of dollars in the world. And New Jersey makes it possible for many New Yorkers not to have to think about the infrastructure that is needed to maintain that kind of lifestyle. So many of the plants, whether they be, power plants, waste facilities, even the port of New York and New Jersey is all in New Jersey. So, our issue is, when it comes to justice is, the siting of these polluting facilities in communities where people live, and communities that have already been historically overburdened through a number of factors, not just environmental, but also educational, economic, housing, you name it. And so, our work really centers on justice for those communities, through policies that speak directly to the needs of those communities. So, for example, one of our main policy planks is mandatory emissions reductions in climate change policy. So, we don't often talk about decarbonization. We don't often use that language, mainly because, when we see climate change policy, it normally it's very carbon centric. But, as we know, many of these carbon producing facilities are also have co-pollutants that are coming out of these stacks and these tailpipes, and those are impacting the people that live closest. And so, we always want to see policies and actions that are targeted at those communities that are overburdened. And I will stop there and pass it to my colleague, Angelo.
Thank you, Melissa. Angela, I guess the floor is yours, but I'd first like to share with Melissa that I saw a movie called The Sacrifice Zone that talks about the situation that's occurring in the Iron Belt region of near Newark, New Jersey. So it's interesting stuff that are happening there, and we're happy that New Jersey has you there and you have the support of Green Latinos in the working group for climate and clean air.
Thank you. Thank you for uplifting the Sacrifice Zone. While we're talking about documentaries, I also want to shout out the story of plastic that our very own Yvette Arellano has a role in telling that story, which is very much related to what we're talking about today.
Yes. All right, Angela, the floor is yours for a quick introduction, and we'll get to the questions.
Great. Thank you, Paul. First, I just want to say what an honor and privilege it is to be on a panel with such amazing leaders and just amazing folks in their own right. And it's been a privilege to work with all of you on this panel and on working towards environmental justice and climate justice. So I'm Angelo Logan, and I am the Policy and Campaign Director for the Moving Forward Network. The Moving Forward Network is a coalition of 55 plus organizations across the country. We're in 20 cities, and we coalesced in around 2010 around port and freight issues. And so we have members that are from a variety of sectors. We have academic partners, a couple of mainstream environmental organizations, and the majority of our folks are frontline community-based organizations. And the network of coalition is led by our frontline community organizations and lead our work in our campaigns and our goals and objectives. So, our goal really is environmental justice and climate justice, really getting to the core of environmental justice, or at least one of the cornerstones, which is self-determination, and realizing that if we are going to really achieve environmental justice, it has to be done for and by the frontline led communities. And so all of our members have agreed to allow for the front lines to lead and work towards their goals and objectives. We coalesced around ports and freight issues. So the way that we define ports is not just seaports, but also inland ports and everything in between. So that's seaports, intermodal facilities, rail yards, freight corridors, warehousing, and inland ports. And ultimately, one of the things that brought us together is that all these communities across the country that are dealing with the international trade at the local level are really dealing with what we call diesel death zones. The accumulation of freight transportation, whether it's heavy duty trucks, locomotives, ocean going vessels, cargo handling equipment, and warehousing, really creates a concentration of diesel in communities. And so we've been working towards promoting zero emissions in freight. But I just want to say that as we are working towards zero emissions in freight, that we don't believe that that is the silver bullet, that zero emissions is not going to achieve environmental justice. It is one component to work towards environmental justice, but it is not the end all, right? We have to really think about just transition, the kind of the issues around cradle to grave issues in terms of acquiring materials and minerals for the zero emission technology. And we just have to think about how the local communities are going to prosper as a result of transforming those communities from diesel death zones to really vibrant, thriving communities, and making sure that we are going to benefit from that and not the same old corporations like BP and other fossil fuel industries that are now transitioning and looking at electrification as their bread and butter. And so, again, MFN is led by frontline community-based organizations, work towards environmental justice, climate justice through a real equity lens in freight communities. And thanks for inviting me to participate on this panel.
Thank you, Angelo, and thank all of you for your introductions. We're making good time. We have a couple, for the next 30 minutes, we're going to be asking a series of questions. We'll give each panelist about 2 minutes each to answer each question. What's great about your introductions is that you already answered some of the questions we'll be having, so you'll be able to build upon what you already shared with members of our audience. So our first question, I'll give it first to you, Yvette, and you'll be free to pass it to any one of your fellow panelists, is that each of you are leaders in your communities in working to protect frontline communities from port pollution. Have there been any specific solutions, programs, or policies that you encountered that has been able to make a tangible difference in reducing port emissions or protecting public health that you would like to share with the membership of Green Latinos? So we'll start with you, Yvette, about 2 minutes, and then pass it to anyone else.
Great, thank you. Yeah, of course. I'll start off with our local work because I really do believe that local power is extremely powerful and important to our work. So we collectively have formed comments with other grassroots environmental justice organizations here in Houston, bringing together both historically disadvantaged communities that are Spanish speaking, so our Latino, Latinx, Hispanic community, and historically Black communities, to ask the EPA to really demand from the EPA to pull reasonable available technologies methods and to pull them and basically submit a revision, because the state of Texas refused to make any changes in regards to the state's implementation plan that really goes toe-to-toe with the Clean Air Act. So saying, hey, Texas isn't doing anything to do any reforms to increase protective measures. Best available science says that 50 parts per million is a more protective standard, and Texas isn't following up. So highlighting the importance of the history of our communities, the importance what our communities are made up of, and then highlighting research that literally states, hey, exposure in disproportionately impacted communities from air toxics from both industry and transportation infrastructure is an important issue to tackle. At the state level, we worked on increasing public participation through our language justice work, developing templates and creating infographics to target major metropolitan areas, including El Paso, Laredo, San Antonio, Dallas, Corpus Christi, and Houston. Bringing together a social media toolkit, English-Spanish communications, and even formed an organizational sign-on of 35 organizations from local to the national. And big thanks to Green Latinos for helping us there. And then lastly, working on the Breakthrough from Plastic Pollution Act of 2021, which I'll drop a link, that once again tackles language justice. It's so important for our communities to have access to information in the languages that we speak. So not just Spanish, Vietnamese, migrant communities throughout. Also pushing for no new exports, a pause on and halt on new infrastructure projects, and the reduction of toxics in plastics, counting out 144 chemicals that cause human health harm. So those are the 3 pieces we've worked on so far. Thank you so much. And I'll pass it over to Melissa.
Thank you. I think for us, some of the most important things that we've done is to build power by working in coalition. There are many organizations in New Jersey. We actually have quite a few environmental organizations in New Jersey. However, with everyone working in their own corners, we've never been able to have the type of movement on the policy side as we have when we work together. And so about 12 years ago, a group of environmental, labor, faith organizations from New York and New Jersey came together to form the Coalition for Healthy Ports. And we've been working together since then to move the needle on emissions generated by goods movement, port activities in New York and New Jersey. In that time, there've been many obstacles, which I know we're going to talk about next. But the working together, I think, is what keeps us all in it, because longevity is the key. None of these are short-term battles. And as long, an organizer that's well known here in New Jersey said, as long as we don't all give up at the same time, we can keep things moving ahead. So one thing that New Jersey Environmental Justice Alliance did in collaboration with partners recently is a study on emissions in the Ironbound that you mentioned, Paul, which is one of the port side communities in New Jersey. And one interesting thing we found and was really interesting is that we, like many port impacted communities, do truck counts, which, and truck counts can be great as a community organizing tool. Sometimes they're good as a policy tool, and other times not so much, depending on who you're talking to. But in terms of helping folks to see an issue and to really look at it with new eyes, it's very important, because we get used to seeing certain things, especially in New Jersey. You get used to seeing smokestacks on the horizon. I'm sure others can relate, right? So, to get folks really looking at what is happening, what kind of trucks are coming through the community, counting them, classifying them. And the corner that was closest to my house, where I would count trucks with my kids, as a result of the study, we found out that we were more impacted by emissions from rail on that corner, from a nearby rail yard, than we even were the trucks. So the thing that highlighted for me is that policies really have to be directed at communities, right? We need data on community level, because from zip code to zip code, from census tract even to census tract, there may be different impacts. So, it doesn't always work to have these like universal policies, which can help, they're a start, but we always need policies that get at the emissions reductions in the communities that are most impacted. And so, again, that's really where NJEJA has always come in with that push and that ask. And with that, I'll pass it to Angelo.
Great, thank you, Melissa. The Moving Forward Network is a network, our coalition of organizations. So in terms of like the work that we've done, I would just say from the jump is that the most important thing that has happened within MFN is really about coalescing, coming together, connecting the dots, and building a stronger movement within the network, and building power in community, and really helping and supporting that local power, and then connecting that to the national level. And we hope that we can then take that and parlay it into not just a national movement or national work and power building, but international as well, as it relates to freight and goods movement. I wanted to put in the chat a link to the Moving Forward Network's website, and there you'll find, at this link, our landing page for the campaign that we just recently launched, which we're calling Zero Emissions Now, Demand Zero Emissions Freight Now. And in that, you'll find a case study that we pulled together and that we worked on. It took us about a year. And this case study is making the case for zero emission solutions in freight, community voices for equity and environmental justice. And so what we've done is we're able to pull together community voices to really identify what the issue is and what the solutions are, to really do the best that we can to really promote local solutions from freight communities. And so we pulled together these local stories, local solutions, and then we work with our network of folks and supporters and allies to pull together a number of policy solutions, right? And solutions that could be implemented from the local all the way to the federal level. And so this is the menu of options that folks can take and be able to work towards some of these local solutions within your local jurisdiction. And so we've taken that and we've taken the local solutions and the stories and worked with our members to identify our priorities. And we've taken that and applied it to our national campaign. But this making the case for zero emission solutions, local voices, is really meant to be able to use, just as Melissa mentioned, there isn't a silver bullet across the board, right? We can implement some national policy, but in each community throughout the country, there may be different approaches and different needs and different political wills, right, to kind of implement some of these policies. So there's a menu of options, not to say that this is, every option there is, but it's a starting point. And so for folks that are in freight communities and ports, I urge you to look at those and look at some of the local stories. They're going to resonate because there's a lot of similarities with communities. You mentioned the Ironbound community. I grew up in a community that's very similar to Ironbound, right? With multiple power plants, trash incinerators, lead smelters, major, diesel concentrations, whether it's warehousing or inland ports and so forth. And so a lot of communities experience similar things. And so you're going to hear some of these stories that are very similar in this report. And then there's local solutions to that. But I wanted to pivot to, what we see as some of those solutions that we're working towards, really first and foremost, focusing in on our principles in which we center our work. First and foremost, that we are centering our work in frontline community power, then transparency, inclusivity, and accessibility, equity and allyship and coalitions, and then working towards prevention of health disparities, equitable distribution of funding and resources, then focusing on the just transition part, which is workforce development opportunities, making sure that we have a strong regulatory framework with enforceable mandates, and that we're thinking about real renewable energy, not false renewable energy, but real renewable energy that is going to be sustainable with zero emission solutions and sustainable approaches. And as we kind of put that together, we really put together a menu of demands to US EPA in the freight sector, demanding zero emissions in all the different categories, from heavy-duty trucks, locomotives and rail yards, marine vessels, cargo handling equipment, and making sure that we are transitioning and implementing regulations, mandates, in all of these categories starting in 2022, and making sure that we are transitioning to those zero emission solutions, requiring that all of these pieces of equipment transition by 2035, and that we retire all internal combustion equipment in these categories by 2045. And so those are some of the categories that we're looking at, but there's other approaches as well, kind of getting at some of the things that Melissa mentioned, for instance, right? We're talking about indirect source rules, and also state implementation plans and local controls of emissions. We think that this is critical to allow for the local communities to engage in those local air control strategies so they can articulate for themselves what's going to make the most sense in their local community, and making sure that those fit into state implementation plans that then the public can enforce and hold the state and federal agencies accountable for reducing it and ultimately eliminating these deadly emissions. So I urge everyone to go to our landing page, sign up to get information, look at the letter that we sent to EPA, and engage with us so that we can push EPA to do what they need to do and hold them accountable to the requirements under the Clean Air Act, and ensuring that we implement all reasonable measures to protect the public's health and address climate change.
Amazing, Angelo, and thank you for your leadership as well too. It's I wanted to mention our next question, and I'll give it back to you, Angelo. Just please keep your comments within 2 minutes, because we have a lot of interesting topics we want to kind of open the door on, open channels of communication, so we could collectively find resolutions that work across the silos that are our communities. So the question I'll ask for you, Angelo, is what do you see is the biggest hurdle in implementing programs that reduce port pollution based upon your experience?
Yeah, ultimately it comes down to power, right? Like, we can have technology. We have technology. The technology fix is not the obstacle. That's not the challenge. It really is political will in implementing or adopting rules, regulations, and mandates. So it's really about a power struggle, right? Are we the counterbalance to industry? Does industry have more power than we do? They shouldn't, right? Because it's supposed to be a real democracy where it's for and by the people, not for and by the corporations, right? Not the 1%. So what we're working towards is that building that power from the local all the way to the national and hopefully globally. And so that when we do have that power to flex, that it's not just about air quality, it's not just about our health, it's about our education, it's about the communities we live in, it's about local economies, it's about all the things that make us whole and real people. So it really comes down to power. And we're working diligently to support our local members in building that local power, not trying to harness it with mainstream national groups or within this kind of like national network. We're just a network where we facilitate our members. It's really about the local groups building the power and really pushing that political will. And we're seeing a shift, even at the national level, right? The fact that President Biden identified environmental justice as a priority. They're not saying that he's actually fulfilling that, but the fact that he even said it shows that we are making headway. So again, the biggest struggle, the biggest obstacle is political will, and that comes down to power. That's just my one opinion, right?
No problem at all. Thank you so much. I guess we'll go to you, Melissa, for your response. Do you want to repeat the question for you?
Okay. No, it was about obstacles, right?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
So, right. So in New York and New Jersey, our main obstacle is that the Port Authority is a bi-state agency, right? It's authority. So it does not beholden to people the way that we see other ports are, so some of the great strides that were able to be made in places like LA or Seattle, we have, over a decade kind of just chipping at the block of the Port Authority and not getting, really deep into their bureaucracy. Honestly, their board is appointed by the governors of both states. They're not answering to, the Department of Environmental Protection, where we do have some leverage. So, again, I think it does have to do with power and leverage. And, it's just been difficult to find those levers with our port. Other obstacles, just, we're still in a pandemic that's actually a syndemic in many of our communities because we're dealing with so many, concurrent issues around health and well-being. And the fact that, we mostly come from organizations that are very scrappy, right? Like, environmental funding is only a small portion of all overall, not-for-profit giving. And then even within environmental funding, environmental justice groups, there have been plenty of studies that show that groups that are led by people of color don't get the same kind of funding. So, we're doing a lot of work with very little funding. We're doing that work at the local, state, and national level. We are traversing areas of like science, law, policy, and we're doing that all, on shoestring budgets. So, that's just the real obstacle, sometimes to winning is just, we have a lot of things kind of like, that we have to work with and work through, in order to even get to the point where we're sitting in a place like this today talking about these issues. So, in addition to, we're not single issue communities, so we're not single issue groups. We may focus on a specific area, but something happens in another and we have to respond. Our members or, our communities have an issue that is outside of our issue area, but we have to respond. So, there are many challenges, but I think we are not swayed.
Thank you so much, Melissa. I guess we'll hear from you next, Yvette, in terms of some of the biggest obstacles you face in terms of your decarbonization efforts.
I couldn't agree with Melissa more than ever. I mean, we shy away from the conversations about funding, especially within our own circles, right? And I agreed with so many of the things that both Melissa and Angelo said about the state implementation plans. I mean, one thing that's always been a hurdle is the fact that the work on state implementation plans has come so much from groups like, Earth Justice and, these large Sierra Club, NRDC, and they never really include community. They don't include community descriptors, vulnerabilities, lack of insurance, the amount of kids who go to school next to the fence line. Where are these numbers that make these comments real, that bring people into the conversation? And that's what's historically been missing. So instead of doing that, being able to incorporate more of a community voice and making sure that while they're, submitting any comments, that they also let communities know, hey, this date is coming up. It's important for you to comment. Here's some things you might want to highlight, but, add that people perspective. And so that's one of the big hurdles. The other one is, states and regions like Texas and the Gulf Coast have been going through, I guess, massive upswings is the best way to put it, in strategic petroleum reserve cells from this administration's own hand. We're talking about, over 18 million barrels of strategic crude oil from reserves over in Bryan Mound and Big Hill, Texas, in West Hackberry and Bayou Choctaw, Louisiana. So how are we going to respond to climate change when we have 18 million barrels, most of that will be exported to other countries, being bought up by ExxonMobil, Valero, Phillips, Motiva, Marathon, and the list goes on. So how can we tackle that expansion, the new terminals, the new exports and imports, if this administration is continuing to feed that process that is exacerbating the global climate crisis, and in turn, just like pollution in general in our communities and the cumulative impacts. And then I just really want to double down on what Melissa said. Our ports at the Port of Houston is an autonomous governmental subdivision. So not all 52 miles is within the Houston even area. So we have 8 cities that are chopping up this massive area, and they're not even beholden to any one government. So that has been a consistent struggle, but working on narratives change and at the different levels that Melissa already highlighted is so important for grassroots to keep on doing. It would just be great to also receive some of that support and capacity.
Thank you so much, Yvette. And I guess we'll ask one more question before we head over to the chat for a Q&A section. And it deals with our new administration in the Oval Office. We have a new administration at the federal government. And what are some critical ways to get the Latinx voice represented on the national stage? I guess we'll start with you, Yvette, and then feel free to pass it to any of your fellow panelists.
Sure. Can you repeat that question real quick?
Oh, yeah. We have a new administration at the federal government. And what are some critical ways that you believe we could get the Latinx voice represented on the national stage for our communities?
Yeah, let's start with no new exports and no new infrastructure. The story of plastic talks about the problem of global plastic waste, and the need to turn off the tap. In order to deal with the global climate crisis, we need to turn off the tap to new oil and gas reserves. I mean, within the first 6 months of this administration, over 2,500 new oil and gas permits were released. So how are we tackling this, this entire problem? Our port specifically is so tied to things like oil, fossil fuels, because we're a massive chemical ports. We're the largest chemical ports in the nation. The other thing they could do is call for a climate emergency. The administration could enact something that is within their power, and in doing so, basically stop new oil and gas permitting, stop offshore oil exploration, and then we can start talking about, net zero or true zero. But until we start actually curbing those emissions by stopping those new infrastructure projects, I really don't see how this administration is moving in the right direction for our future. And in terms of just our communities, especially Spanish-speaking communities, doing the interpretation and translation services is so vital. Even within EPA comment hearings, you don't understand how many times those comment periods happen, and they tell us, make sure your Spanish-speaking people are here before 10 a.m. How can I promise you that a mom, a working person, that I can get them here in the middle of the week during the workday, just because you only have interpretation and translation before 10 a.m.?
I guess we'll hear from you next, Melissa.
Oh, well, I'm just going to ditto what Yvette just said.
Awesome. I guess we'll hear from you next, Angelo.
Yeah, thank you. I really think that this is a pivotal time. Like we had to consider this time to be a moment of crisis and act as such. Allowing for the administration to take baby steps. Like everyone is celebrating that this is like the biggest, most progressive time for environmental justice and other types of issues. For BIPOC communities, we've been suffering, life and death situations for so long, and the globe is now under threat to a point where we need to be pushing even harder, not pandering, not coddling, this administration because, they've been more progressive than we've seen in the past. We need to really push hard and not give way. If we want to see real support from BIPOC and next communities, we need to see real action. This administration is not going to have support if they're not thinking about our communities as whole communities. We can't engage if we're thinking about just these things in silos. We have to think about immigration. We have to think about jobs. We have to think about the environment. We have to think about education. This is a whole community. It is not siloed. And so if you cut one part of that out of our community, then we're not whole and we can't participate fully. And so, for folks that push back and say, we're being too, we're pushing too hard. I say to y'all, we're not pushing hard enough. And if we want to really engage with our communities, we have to push harder and we have to see real action. And until we do, we're not going to see real support. The folks on the opposite end of the spectrum, the far right, they're pushing really hard. They're not apologetic, right? And over here on the kind of Democratic side, let's say, folks are, tiptoeing around. We got to stop doing that. We need to push really hard, come together, coalesce as BIPOC communities, and push like our lives depend on it, because they do.
Paul, and if I could add to that one last thing, it would be jobs. We keep on talking about jobs and creating those opportunities to go into renewable energies or move over to a different industry for, major industry towns like Houston, Texas is so important. So being able to fund programs that educate our youth at the community college level, at the high school levels, and meet our communities where they're at. And it's definitely not going to happen. Our conversation can only go so far before the jobs conversation comes up, right? So where's that investment in those programs, in those certificates, for our communities to dissuade them from going into the military or armed forces and then create a future that feeds into the progress of our communities.
Amazing. Yeah, and that's really amazing. Thank you all for your insight and your response to these questions. We're going to transition towards the Q&A. I don't know, Irene, if you want to take so we have a lot of questions there. I don't know how to go through that, but it's great input from our fellow champions in the Green Latinos community.
Yeah, first of all, just thank you. I have been taking notes. I've been, seeing a lot of likes and thumbs up to basically everything you all are saying. I think there's a lot of support, and please continue to share any resources in the chat. This is something that will be saved and that we can certainly share out. So thank you for doing that. We do have a question actually from Isabel Segarra Trevino related to jobs and work. And I think you touched on this, Yvette, a little bit, but do you all have specific actual examples of having worked with port workers or, anything related, I would add, and what challenges have you encountered or successes you had? Because I completely agree. In my previous employment working for the city of Los Angeles, there was a ton of talk about just transition, which is not the greatest term, but I think there's a lot of focus also from the national government on funding the transition of workers out of fossil fuels. How do we actually make that a reality? No one has seemed to crack the code. So I'm just wondering, just throwing it back to all of you, whoever wants to jump in.
Well, maybe I'll, if it's okay, I'll start and say that, in our communities, especially communities in and around freight facilities, whether they're ports or warehouse communities, that the folks that live in the community are a lot of times the same folks that work in the facilities. And so when you say, have we engaged with, the workers? So like, have we worked with our tios and tias, our cousins, our neighbors, right? So in a lot of cases, I live in Long Beach, right? In a lot of cases, I've worked in communities where my neighbor is a truck driver or a longshore person or a warehouse worker. And that's very common. And so a lot of times the community-based organizations are made up of both workers and people that live in the residential area. And so for moving forward network, it's critical that we work with the workforce, because it's like we don't live in silos. It's not like we don't work in the same environment or we don't live in the same environment. And so an example of how we've worked with the workforce is, we worked on a report called, let me see, I'm sorry, I forgot the name of it. It's a report on automation in freight. And so we worked with warehouse worker, with a longshore worker, and truck drivers to understand how automation and zero emissions potentially can have an impact on the workforce. And so I'm going to put that report in the chat. And yeah, there's some challenges for sure. But we're stronger together, and it's important that we work together. And again, there isn't really a major separation between the workforce and the community when it comes to ports, for instance. And so I'm going to put that report in the chat. But that's been my experience and the experience with the Moving Forward Network.
Yvette or Melissa, do you want to jump in?
Sure. So it's a little, in New Jersey, it's been a little bit different. So the Coalition for Healthy Ports that I mentioned earlier, we have traditionally worked with labor, in our struggles, mainly, I'm blanking on the name of this union. Okay, never mind. I'm not going to go there. I don't want to mess it up. But we mainly worked with around the misclassification of truckers, which is still an issue, a really big issue. So you have, truck drivers, a lot of the burden for electrification has often been shifted to truck drivers, which is not something we want to see, because of the misclassification of truck drivers as independent owner operators, when really, in some cases, they're pretty much slaves to companies. They're not getting benefits, they're having to pay all of their own expenses, and they're getting paid per load. And at a place like the Port of New York and New Jersey, which is horribly antiquated, that means, long queues of trucks idling, the whole system is kind of broken. So we've worked with, with truckers around those issues. But, again, that's really a federal issue. So, we can talk about it on the state level, but, movement has to be made in other areas as well. And then, another issue that we were seeing is, some of the jobs, the best jobs on the port, which were the longshoremen's jobs. The longshoremen were not coming from the immediate community. So Newark is really like a Black and brown city, and the longshoremen were not from Newark. They were it was kind of like a club almost. Somebody, or you have a family member, and so the coalition and our supporters marched together with the mayor of Newark a few years back, demanding clean air and good jobs, right? And that was us standing together on a platform of new workers deserve these jobs too, but ultimately those jobs aren't the best. Longshoremen's jobs only really become clean, good jobs once that equipment is electrified. As long as they're inhaling all of that diesel, it's a deadly job, literally deadly. Like I've heard story after story of retirees not being able to really even enjoy, the life that they had built on this longshoreman's money because they died so soon after retirement. And then the last thing that I'll talk about is now we're kind of at odds with the way that, the city of Newark, at least, is looking at opportunities through goods movement, because there's this proliferation of warehousing that, many advocates throughout the state, warehousing is becoming a big issue in New Jersey because it's a NIMBY issue. It's getting everywhere, and you have wealthier communities saying, not my backyard, put it where there's infrastructure for it. Guess where there's infrastructure for it? In EJ communities. So, and then we're like, not only, if you want Amazon, you need to pick up some of the burden of this infrastructure, but how about we move, we know we need a just transition from this system. We can't continue to consume like this and in these kind of systems and it'd be okay. Like, we know we can't, but basically right now, the challenge is, how do we create, viable and healthy economic models through this this system of goods movement? I don't have the answer for that, but we know as long as folks are breathing diesel fumes, through the trucks, it's not going to happen. We can't have good jobs in this goods movement while it's so deadly.
And then for us, it's the conversation about workers is a little more difficult because it's so tied to fossil fuels. I'd say, just a caveat, we're a fairly young organization, and so building those relationships and networks is still a lot in the works. But one issue with working with workers is that so much of the fossil fuel workforce is dependent on contract work. So it's not permanent union jobs that are going to be there, 5-10 years from now to sustain those relationships. But more, workers who come in from out of state, where jobs in Texas and along the Houston Ship Channel get promoted outside of the state, like so many other fossil fuel communities. And they come to Houston, live here for 2 weeks, and on their 1 week off, go back to, Colorado or California. And so we see that in the South, in Texas, in Louisiana, in Oklahoma. And it's a big problem for us in creating those sustainable relationships. The other piece to this is, one, Melissa, if you could, put a link to that work that y'all did on misclassification. It's the first time I've ever heard it, but we're dealing with the exact same problem where the fossil fuel industry has taken the burden off of themselves over point source pollution over to, truckers, labeling them exactly like you said, Melissa, independent contractors, and shifting that burden and saying, it's not fossil fuels, it's you, the person who drives the car, who needs to pass the inspection, and the diesel truck driver or the bus that drops off your kids. So that's a pretty important piece for us. And just to latch on to the warehousing issue, yes, warehousing is an issue here as well, especially during the fuel crisis. We're seeing increased infrastructure for warehouses that hold oil and chemicals. So I just wanted to kind of tie that in with you, Melissa.
Oh, you're muted, Irene.
Thank you. I just, with our last couple of minutes, I just wanted to offer up a question from Isabel, which I think is a really poignant one. How can you make SIP revisions more accessible for community? And what resources do you need asking as a local government? So anyone who wants to jump in, maybe we can just have, one or two folks answer that, and then we can close out the session. Angelo, I see you're unmuted.
Yeah, I'll be quick. I responded to that in the chat. I think that, holding the state and federal EPA accountable to the SIP process and requirements under the Clean Air Act is really important. I think the number one way to get the attention of the folks, drafting the SIPs are challenging the SIPs. Most SIPs are not really incorporating all feasible measures, which is required by the Clean Air Act. And if we challenge them, we're going to get the attention of folks, right? And so I would say that's probably the one way to make that happen. There's all kinds of, things under the Clean Air Act that you can follow, but it's going to, that's the long path. Folks have the ability to challenge the SIPs legally. I think that's going to get a lot more attention a lot quicker.
Thank you. I think that is a great note to leave off on. Thank you all for such an incredible session. There's been so many resources shared and so much information. We will, just a reminder, we have all of these sessions recorded and we'll be sending those out. So if you were worried about not catching something that someone said, we'll definitely send that out to our Green Latinos listserv. And just really appreciative, sending a lot of gratitude for the work that you do. Animo, let's all continue to support each other and support the amazing work done locally. I'm a big believer that even though we and Green Latinos work on a national level, it's all of this work that's actually on the ground making an impact. So I would love to continue to figure out how to support one another through these times. So thank you all. Take care, stay safe, and andale, we have some good sessions coming up still, and then we have day 3 tomorrow of the summit. Continue. Okay.
Take care. Bye.
Thank you.